Welcome back, everyone. Let's go a little deeper into the rabbit hole, shall we? In this second half of this week's lecture series, we'll continue our discussion of stereotyping and intergroup prejudice. Let's dive back in. As we learned previously, stereotypes form at the individual cognitive level, but they are ultimately grounded in social structures and perceptions of normative group behaviors. We can define a stereotype as an oversimplified mental image of a category of person that is shared by a large number of people. Of course, every individual is unique, but when we meet a stranger, we try to put him or her into a box. These categorizations form the basis for stereotypes. Let's consider some common stereotypes. How about Americans are loud and obnoxious? Are all Americans loud and obnoxious? Of course not. Are some Americans loud and obnoxious? Well, yes, of course. Are most Americans loud and obnoxious? For people who are prejudiced against Americans, the answer to this last question will always be yes, regardless of the reality. Let's consider some other stereotypes. Mexicans are lazy. Muslims are terrorists. Feminine men are gay. Masculine women are lesbians. Asians are good at math. Black people are dangerous. In all of these instances, the stereotypes involve illusory correlations and erroneous inferences. Of course, not all Muslims are terrorists. But for someone who is prejudiced against Muslims, the reality is distorted and exaggerated. For this reason, stereotypes are often accompanied by prejudice, which, incidentally, can be favorable, but is more often an unfavorable disposition towards members of another social group. In addition to simplifying the social world, stereotypes also enable predictability. Using stereotypes, we can gain an immediate, albeit rudimentary, understanding of how people are likely to behave towards us. All stereotypes are, of course, processed within the individual human brain. The cognitive aspects of stereotyping involve selecting, accentuating, and interpreting information from the social environment. When we see someone, we look for visual cues to social identity. We think about what the normative behaviors are for that social group. And finally, we expect a member of that group to behave in a way that is consistent with those normative behaviors. Stereotypes help us classify individuals into these pre-established groups. In order to put people into these social categories, we tend to minimize differences within groups, in other words, perceive them as more homogeneous than they actually are, and maximize differences between groups, in other words, view the two groups as more heterogeneous than they actually are. This is especially true in relation to traits that are important to us. Cognitive psychologists point out that memory plays an important role in maintaining stereotypes because we tend to remember extreme things better than average things. This, I think, explains our propensity to exaggerate and polarize differences between social groups. Now, members of one social group do not naturally view members of another social group as simply different but equal. There are often value judgments at play here. Unfortunately, we as humans tend to view members of other social groups, especially along racial and ethnic lines, not neutrally, but rather as good or bad, better or worse. Social psychologists have shown that social judgments that accompany stereotypes are often made quickly, sometimes in the blink of an eye. Furthermore, they are difficult to change. People's values usually derive in large part from their group membership. Different groups share different values. Therefore, the difference in values between groups often becomes polarized. The more prejudiced one is in favor of his or her own social group and against another group, the greater the perceived difference in values. Thus, prejudiced people see or imagine larger differences between groups than less prejudiced people. This accounts for much of the anti-immigrant sentiment seen, especially in many Western countries these days. Prejudiced people tend to ignore individual exceptions and look for facts that confirm their negative views of the outgroup. And if those facts don't exist, then sometimes they invent those facts. For such people, stereotypes are used to reinforce a system of inequality. When members of the other social group are judged to be inferior, they are more easily persecuted, as shown in the following clip.
Illegal aliens. Maui, you don't even have any film in there.
Maui don't have a brain in his damn head. He's an idiot. Racist pig.
Deport illegal aliens.
What an asshole. Just a stinking son of a bitch and asshole.
Deport illegal aliens.
You know, this isn't
Racist.
funny. This really isn't funny. It's our country and our sovereignty. This has nothing to do with you, Maui. It has something to do with losing our country. And we don't want to do that. And you people are destroying
Hey,
it.
where you from, man?
Hey, you guys, ignore
Where the fuck you from, dude?
Ignore
I'm from Jalisco, Mexico. That's what I'm
Then
from.
go back to Mexico, you fucking cowards.
He's the group.
I'm the coward.
You're the fucking coward.
How am I a coward? I'm here by myself.
Fucking
I'm
coward.
surrounded by Minutemen and I'm the coward?
What would happen if we went into your group?
You're the fucking coward. You come here to mooch off of this country. Why don't you go fix your own country?
You
got no balls, huh?
Beyond
You got no
fixing.
fucking balls.
Why did your
huh?
ancestors come here from Europe?
Where the fuck?
Because they were cowards? Look, and what am I then? I'm indigenous to the continent. I'm indigenous to the continent. I'm indigenous to the continent. I'm indigenous to
Go
the continent.
home. Where's your
You're
pride?
in the butt business?
Go home.
I'm indigenous to this continent.
Indigenous.
The ancestors came here illegally from Europe.
my Social Security, you fucking idiot. Hey, quit pushing me,
Hey,
man.
don't
Quit
touch me.
pushing me, motherfucker. You just pushed me,
I did
man.
not push you.
Fuck you. I saw you push me. I felt it.
Buddy. Hey, where's your
Get the
Mexican
fuck
pride?
out. I don't have any
No
Mexican pride.
pride. You should be
Go to
ashamed of
Mexico, you
yourself.
cockroach.
Go back to Europe.
home.
Go back to Europe, you racist.
I was born here, you prick.
Nothing to make it
Motherfucker.
Your ancestors came here. From where? From Europe, right?
Where'd yours come from?
From
Spain.
here. From
fucking
here.
Spain.
Not here.
Oh, you're
From
Indian?
here.
You're Navajo?
Exactly. Look it up. Del Cruz Jalisco,
Oh,
indigenous
fuck. You
community.
just make trouble. Take your pictures. Why don't you go home and play with your toys?
Are you racist? Are you racist? Go back to Europe
I'm a racist motherfucker.
and take your coconut with you. Eres una coconut, tú sabes.
Why don't you go to the other side of the street? Let's have a-
All of this seems to suggest that the individual can only really be understood in the context of wider intergroup relationships. This is a profound statement if you think about it. What it means is that individual identity and behavior are effectively determined by social structures. In other words, individual behavior can be thought of as a function of one's group membership. In this way, one's behavior reflects the social groups with which one identifies. Stereotypes and prejudice are therefore collective problems, not individual problems. They are grounded in intergroup competition and power relations. Whereas cognitive psychologists may try to explain identity in terms of individual personality or cognitive or motivational processes inherent in the individual, the social psychologists would politely disagree. The social psychologist would argue that people aren't born prejudiced. They become prejudiced as they are socialized into group memberships. We learn who we are from our families, our communities, our workplaces, and by watching the media. This socialization process creates in groups and out groups. Now, members of the in group are defined as us, and members of the out group are defined as them. This, in essence, is the basis for virtually all social competition and conflict. One could even argue that the seeds of prejudice are planted in early childhood. In social psychological experiments, children were found to express a preference for their own country even before they understood the concept of a country. Nationality is a fairly abstract concept that children as young as 6 presumably don't fully comprehend. The same is true of something like race or ethnicity or even religion. Even though young children don't fully understand the different categories associated with these concepts, they still are found to exaggerate and polarize differences between social groups. Tajfal himself conducted a number of experiments to show how deeply ingrained prejudicial attitudes are even among children. For example, he showed a series of dolls with different skin colors to a sample of white children and asked them how much they liked or disliked each doll. The children's preferences for those dolls that look like themselves were found to be primitive and preconceptual. White children strongly preferred looking at white dolls. What's more, these attitudes that are formed in childhood are difficult to change later in life. They become crystallized, so to speak. But here's where the social psychology of prejudice gets really dark and disturbing. We just learned that if we show white children dolls depicting different races, they are likely to have a preference for white looking dolls. But what happens to non white children as they age and become adults? Living in a social world, being socialized into a social world that devalues dark skin, leads to a form of in group devaluation. Thus, people from marginalized and underprivileged groups sometimes show less preference, not more, but less preference for their own group than for the dominant group. They become self hating, if you will, as a result of the status inequality that exists between the social groups in society. Non white people, as they become adults, can develop an inferiority complex that entails self denigration. So it's not only that they are the subject of prejudice by the dominant group, but they also make themselves their own subjects of prejudice. This in group devaluation, whereby members of a subordinate group come to view themselves as inferior victims, is driven by a self fulfilling prophecy, and it's perpetuated by a fixed mindset whereby they come to view their position in society as naturally subservient. This in group devaluation based on group membership can be extremely psychologically damaging and even physically damaging, as demonstrated in this clip on the increasingly common trend of skin whitening, especially in places like Africa and Asia.
This is a Blake buy-in box. It's a care package for my mom back home in Los Angeles. It's always filled with everyday items and a bunch of Filipino goodies. Instant noodles in here, sinigang, soup packets, fruit from my mom's backyard. toothpaste. But then there's this: skin whitening products. Skin whiteners are a big business.
More than $400 million worth of skin whitening products is sold each year in India alone.
8 out of 10 women in Nigeria use skin lightening products, the world's highest percentage.
Skin lightening market in Asia Pacific alone is valued at over $13 billion US.
In 2015, the skin whitening industry was worth about $10 billion worldwide, and by 2024, it is expected to more than triple to $31.2 billion. These products have been around for a long time, and have proven to be damaging, physically and emotionally. So, what accounts for the growing popularity? For starters, skin whitening products rely on advertisements like these.
Wow, you have the most beautiful glowing skin.
Now I have visibly fairer skin.
Skin color forms part of what gives us status and prestige in society. All these negative associations that society has already imposed on dark skin, you can't be happy, you can't find a man, right? You don't fit into society's beauty ideals. So the advertising is only reinforcing and exacerbating pre-existing message.
Thanks to globalization, it's a message that's reaching more people every year. The worldwide cosmetics market was worth about $293.5 billion last year, and it is expected to grow. That growth is fueled by a rising middle class, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, which has the biggest share of the cosmetics market. But these products and the messages of these ads are destructive because they rely on a concept called colorism, which sociologist Margaret Hunter defines as the process of discrimination that privileges light-skinned people of color over their dark-skinned counterparts. One study showed that lighter-skinned black women in North Carolina received shorter prison sentences than their darker peers. Another study found that white interviewers deemed light-skinned blacks and Hispanics more intelligent than dark-skinned people who had identical educational achievements. They also reinforced centuries-old ideas about race and hygiene. Check out these old SOBADs.
This was part of a larger project, right, of presenting white civilization, European civilization as superior. And here the association is that blackness is a form of uncleanliness that can be wiped away, but it's also in many ways simply a very blatantly racist ad.
During the Civil Rights era, the Black Power movement sought to counter this idea with messages like "Black is beautiful." But that message hasn't undone the damage wrought by centuries of colorism.
Why do you want that skin color?
Because it looks lighter than this kind, because this looks a lot like that one.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I just don't like the way brown looks, because the way brown looks really nasty for some reason, but I don't know what reason. That's all.
These products are also dangerous because they can physically damage the skin.
I've seen very intense cystic acne. I've seen irreversible skin thinning from using high-strength hydroquinone. I've seen ochronosis, which is the paradoxical darkening of the skin.
Aside from creams and soaps, there's a wide variety of ways people are lightening their skin, like getting chemical peels, using glutathione injections or pills, or even applying cleaning bleach to their face and body. Hydroquinone is a highly toxic chemical used in photo processing, rubber manufacturing, and hair dyes, but it is also one of the most commonly used ingredients for skin whitening. It's regulated in the US and banned in certain countries abroad, but consumers get their hands on high concentrations of it through under-the-table sources. In the US, light-skin beauty standards still exist in more subtle messages like, "Who is considered the most beautiful?" and some celebrities of color appearing to have lighter skin over time.
You are looking to be white. What do you say to that?
I will say that as an adult, you decide to do things. It's like, do you guys condemn people who tan their skin? Is that something, do they do it because they hate themselves? No, it's a choice as an adult.
While wanting lighter skin is not a crime, nor is it necessarily bad, it's important to be conscious of this choice and why it's different from skin tanning or putting on lipstick. Because ultimately, from applying creams and getting regular treatments to avoiding skin tanning altogether, skin whitening is a way of life. Attitudes are starting to change with inclusive makeup lines and emojis, media campaigns celebrating dark skin beauty, and more celebrities talking about the issue.
Black woman. I still feel like that's what we're fighting, healing from the past.
But many people are still unaware of their preferences for light skin because it's so deeply ingrained in society. And despite the criticism and safety issues of these products, the projected growth in sales means the world still has a long way to go until the practice of skin whitening becomes obsolete.
So, what does all of this have to do with work and employment? How can we apply social identity theory to the workplace? We'll answer this question more fully in future lectures, but for now I just want to make some preliminary remarks about diversity and discrimination at work. And when I talk about diversity and discrimination, I'm not just talking about race and ethnicity. There are many other different forms of legally protected categories of employees and job applicants beyond race and ethnicity, including, for example, gender, disability status, age, religion, national origin, creed, sexual orientation, pregnancy status, familial status, etc. And these are the legally protected individual differences. There are also many other forms of discrimination that are not protected in employment law. For example, discrimination on the basis of physical appearance or attractiveness, accent discrimination, or even social class discrimination. So, why do we even need to protect, for example, non-white job applicants from employment discrimination? Well, the reason is that prejudice is real. Employers and recruiters, just like you and I, exaggerate and polarize differences between social groups. Employers and recruiters impute stereotypes against certain categories of people. When an employer chooses not to hire a young woman because he thinks she'll just get pregnant and go on maternity leave, this has society-wide impacts, for example, on the gender pay gap. Similarly, self-devaluation on the part of marginalized and underprivileged groups creates a downward spiral, whereby such job applicants suffer from a lack of self-confidence to be successful in the labor market. This lack of self-confidence, coupled with employment discrimination on the part of employers, effectively strengthen and maintain inequality both at work and in society. As I said, we'll expand more on the relevance of accentuation and social identity theory in future lectures, but for now, I'd like you just to brainstorm a bit about how else they might relate to employment discrimination. Okay, we'll see you next week. Bye for now.